here's where we really are, right? So this is all the projections that the IPCC made, starting in the year 2000 for all these different scenarios that they imagined for our future for the next 100 years. And all these different worlds, right, where like the planet did or didn't decide to do something about climate change in different ways, globally or regionally, or fast or slow. And we're worse than the worst one of them. I mean, this sucks. Like, does anyone not get this graph? Showing the data being higher than any of the IPCC modeled scenarios.
What were the models done? These all different time periods, or were they?
Yeah, they were sort of. Each one of these scenarios like envisions a whole world that kind of goes along with this model with different ways of developing. And they've been updated for the 2007 report, but I think they all sort of started their projections in the year 2000 because it just gave them a solid 100-year frame.
Yeah, you can see how they all converge on that 2000 point. That's when they kind of set the 0 time.
Yeah, for entering these make-believe worlds. So then for those of you guys on the phone, for slide 13 and 14, go into your full slide view so you can see this cool animation that Holmes Hummel did. So,
Hey, Rebecca, just a question before we go into 13. This is Michael again, sorry.
No worries.
A1B, A1F1, is there a list of these models that correspond with this chart?
Mm-hmm. So, they're called SRES. Specific something scenarios something. Can you Google SRES, IPCC SRES, emission scenarios or something? And so there's a whole from the IPCC website. There's a whole document you can download that explains like what A1B is, what A2 is.
Special report on emission
Emission
scenarios.
that our emissions are worse. This isn't climate change effects are projected. This is our emissions are increasing at a faster rate than our highest estimates can absorb. Therefore, we can assume that the projected effects of global warming, based on the emission scenarios, will amplify as well. Is that kind of the take home from this?
Basically, this is the take home here is showing that we've got all these scenarios that the IPCC came up with, and some are like showing us doing great things, and some of us are showing bad things. And one of the worst ones.
That's good, Sophie.
Sophie, get off the phone. There we go.
Oh my god.
Okay, could you give me a better
So,
Sophie, can you mute it? Or is that Leah?
Directly in front of this ticket booth.
Is that Sophie?
It's not me. It's not Leah.
I think it's Sophie.
Okay. Okay, and what is the classroom number?
Oh God.
Sophie.
Sophie.
Someone like G-Chat or something.
Okay, thank you.
Are we good? Okay. Anyway, so basically the take home from this is that the current situation is worse than any of the modeled situations.
Hi, this is Sophie. I'm sorry, I heard you before. Sorry.
we all got to hear your conversation on the phone.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So going to slide 13 here. This is. There you go. This gives you an idea of. If you guys are all playing this on your own computers, if you're on the phone here. So the difference between our emissions and CO2 level in the atmosphere, right? Because they're such different things. So as you can see, watching the emissions rate there, the blue line is corresponding to how much we're pumping, the faucet basically, how much we're pushing up into the atmosphere. And then the red line down at the bottom is how much that means for the total amount in the atmosphere. So now watch as we have peak CO2 emissions up top, and we're starting to decrease our CO2 emissions. But look what that does to the red line, the total concentration, right? It doesn't drop off, it just plateaus because we're still pumping CO2 into the atmosphere. We're just doing it at a slower rate. So it's not, the take home here is we're not looking to just, lovely.
Go back to your presentation.
Sorry guys. Alright, here we are. Go back. CO2 emissions rate doesn't mean that we're actually lowering the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Like I've talked about this before in the science reports. Did you guys get that? That like when we go to zero emissions, we're only like flatlining the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the only way to actually get it to come back down is to pull the plug, right? To actually pump it out. So carbon sequestration, or let the natural world pull it out itself.
What's the time frame on that thing?
This is just sort of a conceptual idea to understand the difference between emissions.
Yeah.
And even though emissions are dropping, they're still positive. Like that's still stuff that's being pumped up there. Yeah. So this is just a concept.
And along those lines, it should be noted that we're still increasing the rate at which we're pumping out CO2. We haven't even begun to slow down.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And yeah. So the rate. We'll get back to that in a second. And so then slide 15 is also sort of a perspective here. This concept called historical responsibility, which is that like it's not just how much we're pumping up there today, it's how much is up there already. And so if you look at the column on the left is cumulative emissions, and we are the dark gray. We are responsible for about 30% of all the CO2 that's up there already. So the developed world is responsible for more than half of it. And people always talk about like China and India, but they're a very small part of what's up there already. Even though, today, and when was this one? This is in 2004, when China was still a little below us. Today, China's a little above us. And they're growing at a huge rate. So this is the flux in growth, how much they're growing. And we are still growing, but we're not growing as much as they are. But I think this is just a good reality check also that, like, a lot of people, like, shunt all the blame over to China and India and are like, yeah, well, we shouldn't do anything if they're not doing anything. But a lot of one of the developing nations' arguments at Copenhagen in these meetings is that countries who have already put all that CO2 up there that is causing climate change right now have this historical responsibility, and so they need to pay for that. And this is also this concept called the polluter pays principle, which is like those who created the need to adapt should have to pay for it. And these countries are saying, it shouldn't be like us helping them adapt should be charity to them, or like this kindness that we're doing, that it should be considered obligatory restitution for damages done. Like this is damages done right there. We've done that and we should pay for it, and that's what they're saying, and it's got a lot of weight to it. Yeah, we're responsible for most of what's up there now. It's not just about what's being pumped up there today. So I think that's a big concept to keep in mind too going into Copenhagen, that we have a huge historical responsibility here. Going back to what Matt LePay's point just was, which is that, so, we are climbing, and you can look at our growth rate here, like around 2000, this used to be about 2% growth emissions per year, and now we're at since 2000, we've been at 3.5% growth. So not only are emissions, the amount that we're pumping up there increasing, but the rate of growth is increasing too. So first we have to try to if we want to make this better, we just have to try to flatline our growth, and then we have to start chopping down our growth. But right now, the rate of growth itself is increasing, which is so far on the other end of the spectrum from where we're trying to get to of decreasing, when people talk about getting down to 1990s emissions levels, we're breaking records every year, and we're breaking them at faster rates. So I think this is another important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now let's look at, we're going to combine this 2 degrees C target with what that means in terms of CO2 levels in the atmosphere and our emissions. So now we're on graph 17, and so these are all these different situations here where we've got CO2 levels in the atmosphere here on the x-axis of the right-hand diagram, and on the vertical axis what that means for temperature rise. And so we've got the light blue line, the dark blue line, and the red blue line, and those correspond to those different climate sensitivities, right? We don't know which trajectory we'll be on because we don't quite sure how sensitive the climate is. But 3 degrees here, the dark blue line, that's sort of our best guess.